January 1946, over 51,000 Italian prisoners of war were being shipped back home after years in American captivity, but thousands of them didn't want to leave. These captured enemy soldiers had discovered something in their prison camps that would make them risk everything to return to the country that had defeated them. What could American captivity have shown them that was more powerful than their own homeland? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1940, young men across Italy put on uniforms and marched off to war. They believed the promises their leaders told them. They believed Italy would be strong and powerful. They believed victory would come quickly. But the promises were lies. The Italian soldiers traveled to North Africa with old rifles and worn boots. Their trucks broke down in the desert heat. Food came in small amounts, never enough to fill their stomachs. Water was precious, rationed drop by drop under the burning sun. They watched their friends fall sick from disease and hunger. The German soldiers they fought alongside had better guns, better food, better everything. The Italians knew they were unprepared. They knew they had been sent to fight a war their country could not win. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers had been captured. Some surrendered to British forces in the sand dunes of Tunisia. Others laid down their weapons in Sicily when Allied troops landed on Italian soil. They expected the worst. Stories spread through the prison camps about what happened to captured soldiers. They had heard about labor camps where men worked until they died. They had heard about starvation and beatings. They prepared themselves for suffering. When the guards told them they were being sent to America, confusion spread through the camps. America was an ocean away, a place most of them had only heard about in stories. Some had relatives who had moved there decades ago, sending letters home about a strange new world. But most knew nothing about it. They only knew America was their enemy. They were prisoners of war, and prisoners did not get treated well. The journey across the Atlantic took weeks. The Italian soldiers crowded into the dark holds of transport ships, packed shoulder to shoulder. The ships rocked in the waves, making many of them sick. They had little food and less information. Guards watched them but did not speak to them. The Italians whispered to each other in the darkness, wondering what waited for them on the other side of the ocean. When the ships finally reached American ports, the prisoners climbed up onto the deck and saw their first glimpse of the new world. Massive buildings rose into the sky, taller than anything they had seen in their small Italian villages. Cars moved through the streets in endless streams. Electric lights blazed even in daylight. The docks bustled with workers moving cargo with cranes and machines. Everything moved fast. Everything looked clean and organized and impossibly wealthy. The prisoners were loaded onto trains. These were not the cramped cattle cars they expected. These were passenger trains with seats and windows. The guards did not beat them or shout at them. Instead, the guards simply told them where to sit and handed them small packages. Inside each package was food. Real food. White bread sandwiches with thick slices of meat. Apples that were red and fresh. Cookies wrapped in wax paper. Some of the Italian prisoners stared at the food, not believing it was meant for them. Others ate quickly, afraid it might be taken away. As the trains rolled through the American countryside, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows. They saw farms that stretched for miles, with barns painted red and fields full of crops. They saw small towns with paved streets and houses that looked sturdy and well kept. They saw factories with smoke rising from tall chimneys, bigger than any factory in Italy. Every mile brought new evidence of wealth and abundance that seemed impossible. The prisoners talked quietly among themselves. How could a country at war have so much? How could the enemy be so rich while they had been so poor? In Italy, even before the war, many of them had struggled to find enough food. Their families lived in small stone houses with dirt floors. They had walked barefoot to save their only pair of shoes. But here in America, even the countryside looked prosperous. When the trains finally stopped, the prisoners arrived at camps built to hold them. But these camps were not what they expected. There were no high walls topped with broken glass. There were no guard towers with machine guns pointing down at them. Instead, they saw rows of wooden barracks that looked clean and new. They saw open spaces with grass. They saw American soldiers who carried rifles but did not point them or threaten them. The prisoners were assigned to barracks and given beds. Real beds with mattresses and blankets. Not straw on the ground. Not hard wooden planks. Actual beds. They were shown to showers where hot water ran from the pipes. They were given soap and towels. They were told when meals would be served. That first dinner in the American camp changed something in the minds of the Italian prisoners. They lined up expecting thin soup and stale bread, the same rations they had survived on for months. Instead, they were given metal trays loaded with food. Mashed potatoes with butter. Vegetables that were fresh and green. Meat that was thick and hot. Bread that was soft and white. Some of the men stood frozen, holding their trays, not understanding. Was this a trick? Was this a test? The guards motioned for them to sit and eat. The Italians sat at long tables and began to eat slowly, carefully, still waiting for something bad to happen. But nothing bad happened. They ate until their stomachs were full for the first time in years. They looked at each other across the tables, seeing the same confusion and wonder in every face. That night, lying in their beds, the Italian prisoners began to understand that everything they had been told was wrong. This was not how enemies treated prisoners. This was not how war was supposed to work. Something was different here in America, something they could not yet name or understand. But they could feel it in the full bellies and the clean sheets and the absence of fear. What else had they been lied to about? The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. With each passing day, the Italian prisoners discovered something new that shocked them. It was not just the food, though the food continued to amaze them. It was everything. It was the way America worked, the way Americans lived, the way this whole country seemed to operate on a different set of rules than anything they had known. Every morning, the prisoners lined up for breakfast. The camp cook served eggs and bacon, hot coffee with real sugar, and toast with butter and jam. The prisoners had grown up in villages where eggs were special treats saved for holidays. Here in the American camp, eggs came every single morning. The bacon sizzled in huge industrial pans, dozens of strips at a time. The coffee was strong and hot, and there was always more if they wanted it. The Italian prisoners could not understand how the Americans could give so much food to their enemies while fighting a massive war across 2 oceans. One morning, a truck arrived at the camp carrying something the prisoners had never seen before. The American guards called it ice cream. It came in large metal containers packed in ice. The cook scooped it into bowls and handed it to the prisoners. The Italians tasted the cold, sweet cream and stood in stunned silence. This was a dessert rich people ate in fancy restaurants in Rome or Milan. This was not something you gave to prisoners. Yet here it was, handed out on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon because the weather was hot. The prisoners were put to work, and this too revealed more about America. They were sent to farms where they helped harvest crops. The American farmers had tractors that could plow a field in hours, work that would have taken their families back in Italy days or weeks with horses and hand tools. The barns were filled with equipment they had never imagined existed. Machines for planting, machines for harvesting, machines for sorting and cleaning. Everything was mechanized, efficient, and fast. One prisoner named Giovanni was sent to work at an army depot where supplies were stored and sorted. On his first day, he walked into a warehouse that stretched so far he could barely see the other end. The building was filled with boxes stacked 20 feet high. Canned food, medical supplies, uniforms, boots, tools, weapons, everything an army needed. And this was just one warehouse. There were dozens more just like it. Giovanni thought about the Italian army, how they had run out of bullets and bandages, how soldiers shared one rifle between 3 men. He looked at the endless rows of supplies and felt something break inside his understanding of the world. The work was not easy, but it was not cruel. The American supervisor showed them what to do and expected them to do it well. The prisoners were paid $24 a month for their labor. It was not much by American standards, but it was more money than many of them had ever held at one time. They could buy small things at the camp store: cigarettes, candy, soap, writing paper. The simple act of choosing what to buy felt strange and wonderful. As the months passed, something remarkable began to happen. The Italian prisoners were allowed more freedom, especially after September of 1943, when Italy switched sides and became an ally. The Americans created something called Italian service units. Prisoners who volunteered to help the American war effort were given more privileges. They received Italian uniforms with special badges. They were called workers instead of prisoners. About 9 out of every 10 Italian prisoners volunteered. They wanted to help defeat the Germans who had used them and lied to them. The prisoners who became part of these service units were allowed to leave the camps under guard. They worked in hospitals, helping care for wounded American soldiers. They worked in factories, making supplies for the war. They worked on farms, growing food to feed the nation. And slowly, carefully, they were allowed to meet Americans outside the camps. On Sundays, some of the prisoners were escorted to Catholic churches in nearby towns. The Italian families who had immigrated to America years before came to these churches. When they heard that Italian prisoners were attending Mass, they opened their homes. They invited the young soldiers to Sunday dinner. The prisoners sat at family tables and ate pasta made by Italian grandmothers, who cried to hear news from the old country. They played with American children who had Italian names but spoke English. They saw how Italian immigrants had built new lives in this country, how they had gardens and cars and steady jobs. In New York, prisoners who had earned the trust of their guards were taken on trips into the city. They visited the Empire State Building and rode elevators so high their ears popped. They stood at the top and looked out over the vast city spreading in every direction. They went to the Bronx Zoo and saw animals from Africa and Asia. They walked through museums filled with art and history. American families smiled at them on the streets. Children waved. No one seemed afraid of them or angry at them. One prisoner named Marco was taken to work on a farm in Kansas. The farmer who ran the place was a quiet man with weathered hands and kind eyes. He was a Mennonite, part of a religious community that believed in peace and helping others. Marco and 3 other prisoners worked the fields alongside the farmer and his family. When lunchtime came, the farmer's wife did not make the prisoners eat separately. She set extra places at the family table inside the farmhouse. She served them the same food her own family ate: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, bread still warm from the oven, and pie for dessert. Real pie with apples and cinnamon. Marco sat at that table and felt tears in his eyes. He was an enemy soldier. He had fought against this country. Yet here he was, eating at this family's table, treated with respect and kindness. The farmer asked him about his family in Italy. The farmer's wife gave him extra help and told him he was too thin. The children asked him to teach them Italian words. Marco realized that these people did not see him as an enemy. They saw him as a young man far from home, and they wanted to help him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The discoveries kept coming. A truck arrived at one camp with cases of Coca-Cola, the sweet fizzy drink that had become famous across America. The guards passed out bottles to the prisoners. The Italians had heard of Coca-Cola but never tasted it. They drank it and marveled that such a thing existed, that it could be made in factories and delivered to camps in the middle of nowhere. It was such a small thing, a bottle of soda, but it represented something larger. It represented an economy so powerful it could create luxuries even during wartime. The prisoners talked among themselves late into the night. They compared notes about what they had seen and experienced. They talked about the factories that ran day and night, producing endless supplies. They talked about the roads that were paved and smooth, connecting every town and city. They talked about the houses where ordinary workers lived, houses with electricity and running water and heat. They talked about how American soldiers got regular leave to go home and see their families. They talked about how even the guard dogs at the camps were fed better than many Italian families. Some of the prisoners started to ask dangerous questions. If America could do all this while fighting a war on 2 continents, what did that say about the fascist government that had promised Italy glory? If Americans could treat their enemies with such basic dignity and kindness, what did that say about the propaganda that had called Americans cruel and heartless? If ordinary American workers lived better than Italian landowners, what did that say about the economic system they had been taught to believe in? The prisoners began to see the pattern. America's strength did not come from one powerful leader making grand speeches. It came from millions of people working together, free to build their own lives and businesses. It came from farms and factories that competed to be more efficient. It came from a government that was elected by the people instead of forced upon them. It came from a society that valued individual worth and human dignity. The shift was happening inside them, quiet but unmistakable. They had come to America as believers in Mussolini's vision, as soldiers of fascist Italy. But that belief was crumbling with every good meal, every kind gesture, every glimpse of how normal Americans lived. They were beginning to understand that they had been lied to about everything. The real enemy had not been America or Britain or democracy. The real enemy had been their own leaders who had sent them to die for a failed ideology, while keeping them poor and powerless. As 1944 turned into 1945. The Italian prisoners watched the war news carefully. They heard about the Allies pushing through France. They heard about Italy being liberated from German occupation. They heard about their homeland being destroyed by fighting. And they thought about what waited for them when the war ended and they had to go home. The news came over the radio on September 8, 1943. Italy had surrendered. The government that had sent them to war, the leaders who had promised victory and glory, had given up. The armistice was signed. Italy was no longer fighting with Germany. Italy was switching sides. In the prisoner camps across America, the Italian soldiers gathered around radios and listened in stunned silence. Some felt relief. Some felt shame. Some felt anger at the leaders who had abandoned them. But all of them felt something shift in their hearts. They were no longer enemy soldiers. They were men caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. The American authorities came to the camps with an offer. The prisoners could volunteer to help the United States win the war against Germany. They would not fight, but they would work. They would support the war effort through labor. Those who volunteered would be treated differently. They would have more freedom. They would wear Italian uniforms with special badges instead of prison clothes. They would be paid for their work. They would be called service workers instead of prisoners. The choice was not simple. Some prisoners refused. They worried about family members still trapped in northern Italy under German control. If they helped America, would the Germans punish their mothers and fathers, their brothers and sisters? About 3,000 prisoners said no and were sent to isolated camps in Texas and Arizona, kept separate from those who chose differently. But 90% of the Italian prisoners said yes. They signed the papers. They took the pledge. They agreed to perform any work assigned to them except combat against their fellow Italians. They made the choice to help America defeat the Germans who had used Italy and then occupied it when Italy tried to leave the war, for many of the prisoners. This moment marked the complete collapse of everything they had believed. They had been raised under Mussolini's fascism. They had been taught that the leader was always right, that Italy would be great again through strength and conquest, that democracy was weak and corrupt. But here in America, they had seen democracy work. They had seen strength that came from freedom instead of force. They had seen prosperity that came from letting people build their own lives instead of controlling them from above. Giovanni, the prisoner who had worked in the warehouse, wrote in a letter home that he finally understood. He said the propaganda had shown them a twisted version of the world. America was not weak because it gave people choices. America was strong because it gave people choices. When people were free to work hard and keep what they earned, they worked harder than any slave or conscript ever could. When people were free to speak and think and create, they built things that seemed like miracles. The transformation was not just in their minds. It was in their daily lives. As members of the Italian service units, the prisoners worked alongside American soldiers and civilians. They built real friendships. They learned English and taught Italian. They shared meals and stories. The Americans asked them about Italy, about their families, about what life had been like before the war. The Italians asked about America, about how things worked here, about what it meant to be free. In Boston, prisoners worked on an island called POWs. About 50 at a time earned the status of trustee, given to those who worked hard and followed the rules. Trustees could visit parts of the fort that regular prisoners could not enter. On Sundays, they could take a boat into the city. They rowed across the harbor to Boston's North End, the Italian neighborhood where immigrants had settled decades before. The old Italian grandmothers invited them to Sunday dinner. The young Italian-American women came to meet them. Romance bloomed in those Sunday visits. Love growing between prisoners and free Americans, who shared the same heritage but lived in different worlds. One prisoner named Antonio met a girl named Maria at a church dinner. She was the daughter of immigrants from the same region of Italy where Antonio had grown up. They spoke the same dialect. They knew the same songs. But Maria had been born in America. She had gone to American schools. She had grown up with electricity and cars and opportunities her parents never dreamed of. Antonio fell in love with her, but he also fell in love with the life she represented. A life where the future was open instead of closed, where hard work led to reward instead of just survival. The prisoners saw themselves differently now. They were no longer enemy combatants who had lost. They were contributors who mattered. The work they did saved the American government over $200 million. The labor they provided freed American men to fight instead of working in warehouses and hospitals and fields. The prisoners contributed over 90 million days of work. They were part of winning the war against the regime that had betrayed both Italy and them. The Americans they worked with stopped seeing them as enemies too. The labels faded like old paint in the sun. Enemy, prisoner, foreigners, those words meant less and less. Instead, people saw Giuseppe who could fix any broken machine. They saw Marco who sang while he worked and made everyone smile. They saw Stefano who was gentle with the wounded soldiers in the hospital. They saw human beings, not categories. Their relationships deepened. Farmers invited prisoners to holiday dinners. Thanksgiving became a moment of revelation for many Italians. They sat at tables loaded with turkey and stuffing, sweet potatoes and cranberries, pies and cakes. American families said prayers of thanks and included the Italian workers in their blessings. The prisoners felt something break open inside them. This was not how enemies behaved. This was how the family behaved. One prisoner tried to explain it in a letter to his brother still in Italy. He wrote that in America he had learned what dignity meant. It was not about power or conquest or making others bow down. Dignity came from being treated as a person who mattered, whose work had value, whose thoughts deserved respect. The Americans gave him that. Even as a prisoner, even as a former enemy, they gave him his dignity back. The prisoners understood now what they had really been fighting for, without knowing it. They had not been fighting for Italy's glory. They had been fighting for the pride of leaders who cared nothing for the young men they sent to die. The real battle was between two ways of seeing the world. One way was to see people as tools to be used. The other way saw people as individuals with rights and dreams. America had shown them which way built a better world. By 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the prisoners knew they would soon go home. But home meant something different now. They had changed. They could never go back to being the young men who had left Italy believing the promises of fascist leaders. They had seen too much. They had learned too much. They carried America inside them now, whether they wanted to or not. In September of 1945, the war finally ended. The Italian service units were told they would be going home. The prisoners had known this day would come, but knowing it and facing it were two different things. They packed their few belongings into bags. Some had saved money from their wages. Some had letters and photographs. Some had addresses written on scraps of paper, promises to stay in touch with the Americans they had come to love. The hardest goodbyes happened in those final weeks. Antonio stood on a dock in Boston holding Maria's hands, both of them crying. He had to go back to Italy. The rules were clear. All prisoners of war had to return to their home countries. The Geneva Convention said so, and America followed the rules, even when the rules caused heartbreak. Maria begged him to find a way to stay. Antonio told her he would come back. He did not know how, but he promised he would find a way. Across the country, similar scenes played out hundreds of times. Prisoners saying goodbye to the American women they loved. Prisoners saying goodbye to the farmers who had treated them like family. Prisoners saying goodbye to the guards who had become friends. Prisoners saying goodbye to a country that had treated them better as enemies than their own country had treated them as citizens. In January of 1946, the ships left American ports carrying thousands of Italian men back across the Atlantic. The journey was different from the trip that had brought them to America. Then they had been scared and uncertain, crowded into dark holds, wondering what horrors waited for them. Now they traveled with mixed feelings, grateful to be going home, but sad to leave America behind. They stood on the decks watching the coastline disappear, watching the Statue of Liberty grow smaller until it vanished in the distance. The men talked during the voyage. They talked about what they had seen and learned. They talked about the abundance and the kindness. They talked about the machines and the efficiency. They talked about the freedom. Some worried their friends and families back home would not believe their stories. How could they explain what America was really like to people who had never left their small villages? How could they make anyone understand? When the ships finally reached Italy, the men stood at the rails and looked at their homeland. Even from the water, they could see the destruction. Buildings were bombed out by shells. Bridges collapsed into rivers. The ports were damaged, with broken cranes and sunken ships visible in the harbor. This was home, but it looked like a graveyard. The returning prisoners walked down the gangplanks carrying their bags. They had imagined joyful reunions, but what they found was harder and sadder than they expected. Italy was broken. The war had torn the country apart. Cities were rubble. Farms were damaged. Roads were destroyed. The government was trying to rebuild, but there was no money, no materials, no easy answers. Giovanni took a train to his village in the south. The train moved slowly, stopping and starting, because parts of the track had been damaged and poorly repaired. He looked out the window at the countryside he had left years before. The fields looked smaller than he remembered. The houses looked older and more worn. Everything seemed diminished somehow, as if Italy had shrunk while he was away. When Giovanni finally reached his village, his mother ran out to embrace him. She was thinner than he remembered, her face lined with new wrinkles from worry and hunger. His father had aged too, bent from years of hard work with too little food. His younger brothers and sisters crowded around him, touching his American uniform, asking questions all at once. They wanted to know everything about America, about the war, about what he had seen. Giovanni tried to tell them, but the words felt inadequate. How could he explain that in America, prisoners ate better than free Italians? How could he describe warehouses so large you could not see from one end to the other? How could he make them understand what it felt like to be treated with dignity, even as an enemy? He showed them the few dollars he had saved, more money than his father earned in months. He showed them photographs of the camps in the cities. He told them stories, but he could see they did not fully grasp what he was describing. America was too foreign, too different, too impossible to imagine. The contrast hit Giovanni harder each day. In America, he had eaten 3 full meals every day. Here in Italy, his family ate thin soup and stale bread, sometimes only once a day. In America, he had slept in a bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket. Here, he shared a straw mattress with his brothers in a cold stone house. In America, the water had run clean from taps whenever you wanted it. Here, his mother walked half a mile to a well and carried water back in heavy buckets. The opportunities were even worse. Giovanni wanted to work, but there were no jobs. Italy's economy had collapsed. Factories were destroyed. Businesses were closed. Thousands of men had returned from the war, all looking for work that did not exist. Giovanni tried to help on his family's small farm, but the soil was poor and the tools were old and broken. He fixed things with his hands, using skills he had learned in America, but there was only so much he could do with nothing. At night, Giovanni lay awake thinking about America. He thought about the farmer in Kansas who had treated him like a son. He thought about the warehouse where he had worked, the abundance that had seemed endless. He thought about the future he could have there, a future that did not exist in this broken village. He made a decision. He would find a way to go back. Giovanni was not alone. All across Italy, returned prisoners were making the same choice. Antonio in the north wrote letter after letter to Maria in Boston. He saved every lira he could earn doing odd jobs. He filled out immigration papers and waited in lines at government offices. It took him over a year, but finally he got permission to leave Italy. Maria traveled to Italy to meet him, and they were married in a small church in his village. Then together they sailed back to America, where Antonio found work and built a new life. Marco, the prisoner who had worked on the Mennonite farm, returned to Kansas within 2 years. The farmer sponsored him, helping him get the papers he needed to immigrate legally. Marco became an American citizen and eventually bought his own farm. He brought his parents over from Italy when he had saved enough money. They cried when they first saw his house, with running water and electricity and heat. They said it was like a palace. Thousands of former prisoners found ways to return to America. Some married American women and came back as husbands. Some were sponsored by the families and farmers they had worked for. Some used the connections they had made and the skills they had learned. They came back because they had seen what was possible. They had tasted freedom and opportunity, and they could not forget it. The men who stayed in Italy carried America in their hearts. They told their children about what they had seen. They taught them that hard work and freedom built prosperity. They spoke against the kind of government that had sent them to war unprepared and kept them poor. When Italy rebuilt itself in the years after the war, these men were part of building something new, something more like what they had seen in America. They pushed for democracy and individual rights. They remembered what worked and what did not. Giuseppe, who had stayed in Italy to care for his aging parents, started a small business importing American goods. He used the English he had learned and the contacts he had made. He showed other Italians what American products looked like, how American efficiency worked, how American customer service treated people. His business grew, and he employed other returned prisoners who understood what he was trying to build. Years later, when their own children asked them about the war, the former prisoners told a strange truth. They said that being captured was the best thing that ever happened to them. They said that in America's prison camps, they had been more free than they had ever been in fascist Italy. They said that America's enemies had been treated better than Italy's own citizens. They said they had learned what a country could be when it valued people instead of power. One former prisoner, now an old man living in New York, tried to explain it to his grandson. He said that when he first arrived in America as a prisoner, he thought he had lost everything. He had lost the war. He had lost his freedom. He had lost his future. But in that American camp, eating that first good meal, sleeping in that first clean bed, being treated with basic human dignity, he had actually found something he never knew existed. He had found hope. He had found a vision of how life could be different. He had found the truth that propaganda had hidden from him. The old man told his grandson that the real lesson of his captivity was simple. Power built on lies and force always crumbles. Prosperity built on freedom and dignity lasts. The Americans had not won his loyalty by defeating him in battle. They had won his loyalty by showing him a better way to live. They had been decent to a stranger within their gates, and that decency had changed his life forever. Thousands of former Italian prisoners carried that lesson forward. They became Americans and built businesses and raised families. They voted in elections and served their communities. They never forgot where they came from or what they had learned. They told their children and grandchildren that freedom was not just a word. It was something real, something you could see in how people treated each other, in how societies were organized, in how governments served instead of ruled. The men who had been prisoners in paradise had learned the most important lesson anyone could learn. The way you treat people, even your enemies, defines who you are. America had shown them kindness when it could have shown them cruelty. America had given them dignity when it could have taken it away. And in doing so, America had won something more valuable than any battle. It had won their hearts and their belief in a better future. That was the real victory, the one that lasted long after the war ended and shaped the world that came after. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.